The starship dock bustled with activity as ships came and went, their engines humming and crews shouting orders. Ta kept her eyes down, moving quietly behind Merchant Kang. Her blue-tinged skin and silver eyes marked her as different from the humans around her. The neural inhibitor at the base of her skull felt heavy today, its constant pressure a reminder of her place. "Hurry up," Kang barked without looking back. "The meeting starts in 10 minutes. Tai quickened her steps, careful to stay 3 paces behind her owner as they had trained her. 6 years had passed since she was captured and sold. 6 years of hiding her true self beneath a mask of obedience. They entered a large trading hall where merchants from across the galaxy displayed their goods. Kang approached a table where a man with a thick beard examined shining metal parts. "Ah, Kang, you brought your translator. Good." The bearded man nodded at Ta. "These parts came from the Dorian system. Ask her if she can identify them." Kang turned to Tai and gestured at the table. "Well, what are they?" Tai studied the pieces carefully. She recognized them immediately as components for a hyperdrive regulator, likely stolen from a military vessel. Such parts were illegal in this sector, but she knew better than to reveal too much knowledge. "They appear to be engine parts, Master," she said softly. "The markings suggest they are from the Dorian system." "Yes." The bearded man smiled. "See, these servants have their uses." Tada felt a familiar anger rise inside her, but kept her face blank. Before her capture, she had been a respected scientist on her homeworld. Now, humans believed her people were clever animals at best. The neural inhibitor prevented her from speaking freely or acting against her owner's wishes, but it couldn't stop her from thinking. As the men haggled over prices, Tai observed the room. 3 security officers had entered the far door. They moved with purpose, scanning faces. Kang was involved in many illegal deals. If they were looking for him, she would be seized as property. When the meeting ended, Kang led her back through crowded corridors. His business had not gone well lately. Twice now, shipments had been seized. Ta had overheard him talking about selling some assets to cover his debts. Assets like her. That night, in her small sleeping space beneath the cargo hold, Todd worked on her secret project. For years, she had been modifying the neural inhibitor during the few hours when Kang turned it to sleep mode. She couldn't remove it. That would trigger an alarm. But she had learned to bypass some of its functions. She carefully inserted a thin wire into the control panel. A sharp pain shot through her skull, then faded. She had 10 minutes before the device would reset itself. Working quickly, she accessed the ship's computer through a maintenance panel. Night after night, she had been gathering information, preparing for a chance at freedom. The screen showed Kang's financial records. His situation was worse than she had thought. Her heart sank when she saw a new message. Auction scheduled. All non-essential property to be liquidated. The neural inhibitor began to buzz, warning her that reset was imminent. Ta disconnected from the system and removed her tools. As the device resumed full function, she lay on her narrow bed, mind racing despite the inhibitor's dampening effect. 3 days later, Ta stood on a small platform in the station's auction house. Bright lights shone on her as the auctioneer listed her attributes. Lot 42, an Aretian female. 6 years experience as a personal translator. Speaks 22 languages fluently. Healthy, obedient, and well-trained. Neural inhibitor is current model, recently serviced. Opening bid at 5,000 credits. Tai kept her eyes fixed on the back wall, trying not to see the faces examining her. Kang stood at the side of the stage, looking impatient. He wouldn't even get much for her, with the market flooded with Aretian servants since her world fell. The bidding moved quickly. A fat merchant in the front row seemed determined to have her, raising his hand for each new price. Then a quiet voice from the back made an offer. The fat merchant frowned but shook his head when the auctioneer called for higher bids. Sold for 8,200 credits to number 16. The auctioneer announced. A tall man approached the stage. Unlike the other buyers, he met her eyes directly. "I'm Kim Dae-ho," he said as he was handed her control chip. "What's your name?" The question surprised her. Most owners didn't bother learning their servants' names, using only commands or generic terms. "Ta, sir," she answered softly. "Ta," he repeated. "I need a translator for my research expedition. I'm told you speak many languages." 22, sir, she said, wondering what kind of owner he would be. Scientists were sometimes kinder, sometimes crueler in their curiosity. Daho nodded. "Good. We leave tomorrow for the outer systems. I study plant life on unexplored planets. You'll help me communicate with local guides when necessary." He led her from the auction house to his small ship docked nearby. It was a research vessel, not a luxury craft like Kang's. Equipment and specimen containers filled much of the space. "You'll sleep here," he said, showing her a small but private cabin. "The inhibitor will be set to allow you movement throughout the ship except for the engine room and weapons locker." Ta blinked in surprise. A private cabin was unexpected. Servants usually slept in common areas or storage spaces. That night, as the ship hummed beneath her, Ta lay on a real bed for the first time in years. The neural inhibitor felt lighter somehow, though she knew that was impossible. Tomorrow they would leave the station. Tomorrow would bring new planets, new information she could gather. Ta closed her eyes. She would watch this new owner carefully, learn his habits and weaknesses, and continue working on the inhibitor each night. Someday, she would be free. Someday, she would return to her people with knowledge that could help them all escape. Until then, she would wait and watch and remember who she really was. The research vessel Horizon cut through the darkness of space, its engines humming softly. Inside, Ta moved carefully through the laboratory, organizing specimens that Daho had collected from their last planetfall. 3 weeks had passed since he purchased her at the auction, and each day brought new surprises. "Could you pass me that scanner?" Daho asked, not looking up from the purple leaf plant he was examining. Ta handed him the device, watching as he adjusted settings. Unlike Kang, who had barked orders and expected immediate compliance, Daho spoke to her as if she were a colleague. It was confusing and dangerous. The more comfortable she became, the more likely she might reveal too much of her true intelligence. "What do you think of this specimen?" he asked, motioning her closer. "I've never seen this pattern before." Tai studied the plant. Its cellular structure was similar to one she had researched before her capture. She knew exactly what it was, a rare medicinal plant that could treat neural disorders. But revealing such knowledge would raise questions about how his simple servant possessed advanced biological understanding. "It looks unusual, Master," she said carefully. "Just call me Daho," he reminded her for the 10th time. No need for titles. This too was strange. Most owners insisted on formal address to maintain hierarchy. Ta nodded but said nothing. Later that day, as they prepared to land on a small, unexplored moon, Daho showed her how to operate the communication systems. "If anything goes wrong while I'm collecting samples, you may need to contact me or even pilot us out of here," he explained, pointing to different controls. Tai absorbed the information easily but feigned slight confusion. "I will try to remember, Mas. Daho." He smiled. "You'll get the hang of it." On the moon's surface, Daho collected samples while Tai translated his questions for the local guide, a 4-armed being with translucent skin. The creature spoke a dialect related to languages Ta knew, and she adapted quickly. "He says the blue plants are sacred," she told Daho. "We should not collect them." Daho immediately moved away from the blue vegetation. "Thank him for telling us. I would never want to disrespect local customs." His respect surprised her. Kang would have taken whatever he wanted, regardless of local beliefs. Days turned into weeks as they visited one small world after another. Each night, when Daho set her neural inhibitor to sleep mode, Ta worked on bypassing its systems. She had made progress, managing to extend her freedom to 30 minutes before the automatic reset. One evening, as they ate dinner in the small galley, Daho asked her about her life before captivity. The question froze her mid-bite. I was taken during the fall of our colony, she said carefully. I served in a household before being sold to Merchant Kang. But what was your life like before that? What did you do on your world? Ta paused. This was dangerous territory. We had cities, technologies, not unlike humans. I've read that Oricians had advanced science before the war, Daho said, watching her closely. Too closely. Ta lowered her eyes. I would not know about such things. But later, when Daho showed her a star chart and asked about the quickest route to the next system, she accidentally pointed to an efficient path that only someone with navigation training would know. He raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. 2 days later, disaster struck. The ship's proximity alarms blared as 3 raider vessels appeared from behind a nearby asteroid field. Known for attacking research ships for their valuable equipment, raiders showed no mercy to crew or passengers. Get to the escape pod, Daho shouted, rushing to the control panel. I'll try to outrun them. Ta didn't move. She watched as he frantically tried evasive maneuvers, but the raiders were faster. A blast rocked the ship, throwing Daho against the wall. He slumped to the floor, blood trickling from a gash on his forehead. The neural inhibitor hummed against her skull, preventing her from taking control of the ship without her owner's permission. Another blast hit them, and warning lights flashed throughout the cabin. The raiders would board them within minutes. Tai made her decision. Kneeling beside the unconscious Daho, she pressed his limp hand against her neural inhibitor's override scanner. The device recognized his fingerprint and temporarily released its hold on her actions. She rushed to the control panel. Her fingers flew across the screens, accessing systems that she shouldn't have known how to use. She diverted power from non-essential systems to the shields and weapons. Then, with practiced precision that revealed years of pilot training, she spun the ship into a complex evasive pattern. The raiders, expecting easy prey, were caught off guard. Ta targeted the lead ship's engine with a precise burst from their small defense cannons. The raider vessel spun out of control, crashing into one of its companions. The third ship, suddenly alone, turned and fled. Tai quickly tended to Daho's wound, cleaning and bandaging his head. Then she erased all evidence of her actions from the ship's logs. By the time he regained consciousness an hour later, she was sitting quietly nearby, the model of a concerned but obedient servant. What happened? He asked, touching his bandaged head. Raiders attacked, sir, she said softly. You managed to damage 2 of their ships before you were injured. The third one ran away. I followed your earlier instructions about basic first aid. Daho looked at the control panel, then back at her. His eyes narrowed slightly. That's quite fortunate. Yes, sir. Very fortunate. That night, as they continued their journey, Ta noticed Daho watching her with new interest. He spent hours reviewing the ship's logs and security recordings. She worried he had found something she missed, some evidence of her true capabilities. The next morning, he approached her as she organized specimen containers. Ta, he said quietly, I think it's time we had an honest conversation about who you really are. She looked up, her silver eyes meeting his. For the first time since her capture, Tay considered telling a human the truth about her past as a neurophysicist, about the lies told to justify enslaving her people, about the knowledge locked in her mind. The moment stretched between them, full of possibility and danger. I don't understand, sir, she said finally, lowering her gaze. But they both knew that wasn't true. Daho sat across from Tai in the ship's small common area, his hands folded on the table between them. The gentle hum of the engines filled the silence. His eyes hadn't left her face for several minutes. I checked the ship's backup systems, he said finally. The main logs were erased, but the emergency recorder captured everything. You piloted us away from those raiders. You saved our lives. Ta said nothing, her posture rigid. Inside, her mind raced through possible explanations, excuses, denials. No servant could fly like that, Daho continued. Those were military-grade maneuvers, And you accessed systems that I never showed you how to use. I watched you many times, Tai offered quietly. I have a good memory. Daeho shook his head. Please don't lie to me. Not anymore. He reached into his pocket and placed a small device on the table. This is the control chip for your neural inhibitor. I'm giving you the choice to tell me the truth. Tai stared at the chip. Without it, Daeho couldn't control her inhibitor. It was a gesture of trust she hadn't expected. Or perhaps a trap. Why would you do this? She asked. Because I suspected for weeks that everything I've been told about Oricians is wrong. He leaned forward. You're not semi-sentient. You're at least as intelligent as humans, maybe more so. Aren't you? The moment stretched between them. 6 years of careful deception weighed against the desperate hope for understanding. Tai made her choice. Yes, she said simply. Daeho nodded, as if confirming something he already knew. Who were you before? I was a neurophysicist. I specialized in brain-computer interfaces. The words felt strange after so long hiding her knowledge. I had a laboratory at our capital's research center. A scientist, Daeho whispered. They turned a scientist into a translator. They turned thousands of scientists, artists, and teachers into servants, Ta said, her voice growing stronger. When your people first encountered our colony ship, we were vulnerable. Our cryosleep systems had malfunctioned. Half our people were still unconscious. Daeho's face showed his shock. I was taught that Oricians were discovered on a primitive world, that you were uplifted by human contact. A convenient lie to justify exploitation. Ta's hand moved to the neural inhibitor at the base of her skull. These were designed based on our own technology. They took our research and used it against us. For hours, they talked. Ta told him about her world, about the sophisticated society humans had destroyed and then denied ever existed. Daeho listened, his expression growing more troubled with each revelation. The next day, he connected to the galactic network at a distant outpost. Together, they searched through historical archives, looking for the truth about first contact with the Orician people. Here, Ta said, pointing to a file buried deep in military records. These are the original survey reports. The document described a damaged colony ship discovered drifting near the Cygnus Arm. It noted the advanced technology aboard and recommended immediate classification and containment of findings. Daeho found more files, classified research evaluating Orician cognitive abilities. The studies clearly showed intelligence matching or exceeding human capabilities. Yet the public records classified them as semi-sentient humanoids suitable for service roles. This was deliberate, Daeho said, his voice tight with anger. They knew exactly what they were doing. That evening, he helped Ta modify her neural inhibitor. They couldn't remove it completely. That would trigger alarms in any patrolled space, but they adjusted it to give her greater freedom of thought and action. Better, he asked as she tested her new range of movement. Much. Ta rolled her shoulders, feeling the weight of restriction ease for the first time in years. Thank you. As days passed, their relationship shifted. Daeho no longer gave orders but asked for her opinions and expertise. They worked side by side, collecting and analyzing specimens. Ta found herself sharing more of her knowledge, no longer afraid of revealing too much intelligence. These plants have similar properties to ones we used in neural treatments, she explained as they examined samples from a jungle world. We might be able to use them to help other Oricians. Other Oricians, Daeho repeated thoughtfully. How many of your people are enslaved now? Thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands. Ta's voice grew quiet. I don't know how many survived the initial conquest. That night, Daeho couldn't sleep. Ta found him in the control room, staring at star charts. What are you thinking? She asked. That I've been part of something terrible without knowing it. He looked up at her. And that I need to make it right. Over the next week, Daeho contacted colleagues he trusted, scientists who might be sympathetic to the truth. Most refused to believe him. Some cut communication entirely, but a few listened, especially when Tai spoke to them directly, demonstrating knowledge no semi-sentient being should possess. It's not enough, Daho said after another failed call. We need more proof. Something they can't ignore. Ta hesitated, then made a decision. I know where we might find it, but it would be dangerous. Where? My homeworld. The Central Archives contained our complete history, including records of our space exploration and technological development. If they haven't been destroyed, they would prove your civilization's advancement, Daho finished. But your world is under strict control now. Yes, no unauthorized ships are allowed to land. Ta met his eyes. If we're caught, you would be imprisoned. I would be terminated as defective property. Daho was quiet for a long moment. Then he turned to the navigation system. Set a course for your homeworld, he said. 3 days later, as they prepared for the dangerous journey, Daho presented Ta with a document. She read it slowly, her hands trembling slightly. This is Emancipation Papers, he confirmed. As far as I'm concerned, you've been free since the moment you saved our ship. This just makes it official between us. Ta looked up from the paper, her silver eyes bright with emotion. This has no legal standing without system registration. Maybe not yet, but it's a promise from me to you. Daho's voice was firm. No matter what happens, I will never again treat you or refer to you as property. That night, as the ship moved silently toward Orishan space, Ta stood by the viewport, watching the stars. For the first time in 6 years, she allowed herself to imagine a future where her people were free, where the truth was known, where she could be herself again. Behind her, Daho entered the room. He came to stand beside her, looking out at the same stars. Are you afraid? He asked quietly. Yes, she admitted, but also hopeful. They stood together in comfortable silence, no longer master and servant, but two people facing an uncertain journey with a shared purpose. The horizon emerged from its final jump at the edge of the Orishan system. Ta stood at the viewport, her hands pressed against the cold glass as she gazed at the faint blue sphere of her homeworld in the distance. 6 years since she had seen these stars, this arrangement of planets. Her heart beat faster despite her efforts to remain calm. Are you all right? Daho asked, coming to stand beside her. It's strange to see it again, she said quietly. I never thought I would return. Daho studied the navigation display. There are 3 patrol ships near the main entry points. We'll need to avoid them. They had spent weeks preparing for this approach. The horizon now broadcast false identification as a routine supply vessel. Ta had modified their transponder codes using knowledge from her time with Merchant Kang. Still, discovery meant capture or worse. We should use the polar approach, Ta suggested. The magnetic disturbances will help mask our signature. Daho nodded and adjusted their course. As they moved closer to the planet, Ta felt the weight of memory pressing down on her. The neural inhibitor at the base of her skull seemed heavier, a reminder of everything that had been taken from her people. Tell me about your home, Daho said, perhaps sensing her distress. Where did you live before? Ta pointed to the northern continent visible through swirls of cloud. There. In the capital city of Lenos, my laboratory was near the Central University. The ship entered the atmosphere at night, using cloud cover for additional concealment. They landed in a dense forest far from any settlement. As the engines powered down, Ta and Daho prepared for their journey. They dressed in simple work clothes typical of human supervisors and their Orishan assistants. Remember, Daho said, as he carefully adjusted Ta's neural inhibitor to make it appear functional while actually being disabled, if we're stopped, you must act subservient. I remember how to be a slave, Ta replied, her voice tight. I had years of practice. They traveled through the night, avoiding the main roads. By dawn, they reached the outskirts of what had once been a thriving city. Ta stopped at the crest of a hill, her breath catching in her throat. Linus lay before them, but not as she remembered. The elegant spires and domed buildings of her memory were gone, replaced by utilitarian structures. Work camps spread across the valley, surrounded by high fences. Oricians moved in orderly lines, heads bowed, neural inhibitors glinting in the morning light. "They've destroyed everything," she whispered. Daho put his hand on her shoulder. "Not everything. Not you. Not what you know." They entered the city using forged work orders Daho had prepared. Human overseers barely glanced at them, assuming Tai was just another controlled servant. They made their way toward the center of the city, where the university had stood. The archives were housed underground, Tai explained as they walked. 3 levels beneath the main library, if they haven't been discovered. The university grounds had been converted to an administrative center for the occupation. Human officials moved between buildings while Orician workers cleaned and carried. Ta kept her eyes down, fighting the urge to look for familiar faces among her enslaved people. "How do we get inside?" Daho asked quietly. "Service tunnels. This way." They slipped into an alley behind the main building. Ta found the maintenance entrance just where she remembered, hidden behind waste containers. The door was locked, but Daho produced a small device that quickly bypassed the security. Inside, the tunnels were dark and damp. They moved carefully, using a small light to guide their way. Tad led them through a maze of passages, her memory of the layout still perfect after 6 years. "Here," she said finally, stopping at an unmarked door. "This leads to the lower archives." The room beyond was vast and dim, filled with row upon row of storage units. Dust covered everything, suggesting the space had been untouched since the occupation began. "They didn't destroy it," Ta breathed, relief washing over her. They probably didn't even know what they had found. They worked quickly, Tai locating the relevant data cores while Daho kept watch. She downloaded the archives onto portable drives. Historical records, scientific achievements, technological specifications, proof that the Oricians had been a spacefaring civilization before human contact. "This will be enough," she said, carefully packing the drives. More than enough to challenge the classification. As they prepared to leave, an alarm suddenly blared through the building above them. Daho tensed, listening. "That's not for us," he said after a moment. "It sounds like a shift change. We should still hurry." They retraced their steps through the tunnels, emerging again into the alley. But as they turned toward the street, 2 human guards appeared at the entrance, weapons drawn. "You there, stop immediately." Daho pushed Ta behind him. "I can explain. My servant and I were looking for." On the ground. Now, there was no choice. They knelt, hands raised. The guards approached cautiously, weapons trained on them. "Unauthorized area," one guard said, checking their identification. "What are you doing here?" Before Daho could answer, a loud explosion rocked the street beyond the alley. The guards turned toward the sound, momentarily distracted. In that instant, Tai acted. She leaped forward with unexpected speed, striking one guard precisely at the base of the skull. He dropped instantly. The second guard turned back, but too late. Daho tackled him, and together they subdued him. "What was that explosion?" Daho asked as they bound and gagged the unconscious guards. "I don't know, but it's our chance." Ta checked the street. "There's chaos out there. We can blend in with the crowd." They emerged to find workers running in all directions. Smoke rose from a building down the street. Among the fleeing figures, Ta noticed something strange. Some Oricians moved with purpose, not fear. Their eyes were clear, focused. "Resistance," she whispered. "There's an organized resistance." A male Orician bumped into her deliberately. As he passed, he slipped something into her hand, a small symbol etched on metal. His eyes met hers for just a moment, recognizing her uncontrolled state, before he disappeared into the crowd. "What is it?" Daho asked as they hurried toward the city outskirts. "A message, a sign." Ta closed her fingers around the token. We're not alone. They reached the forest by nightfall, evading patrols through back roads and abandoned properties. The horizon waited where they had left it, untouched and ready for departure. As they prepared for takeoff, Ta looked once more at her homeworld through the viewport. The data drives containing her people's true history were secure. The knowledge they had recovered might help free thousands. "We'll return," Daho promised, reading her thoughts. "With help." The ship rose silently into the night sky. As they broke through the atmosphere and set course away from Orishan space, Tai allowed herself a small smile. "Yes," she said, "we will return." The interstellar council chamber stretched before them, its curved walls rising to a glass dome that revealed the stars above. 300 delegates from across human space filled the tiered seats, their voices creating a constant murmur. Ta stood beside Daho at the central podium, trying to calm her racing heart. "Are you ready?" Daho asked quietly. Ta nodded, though her hands trembled slightly. After months of preparation, today they would present their evidence to the council. Today they would challenge the entire classification system that had enslaved her people. The council president, a stern woman with silver hair, called the session to order. "We will now hear testimony regarding petition HC 7819, a request to review the sentience classification of the Orishan species." Daho stepped forward first. Behind him, a large screen displayed images of Orishan cities before the occupation. "Distinguished delegates," he began, "6 months ago, I believed what we all were taught, that Orishans were a semi-sentient species, suitable only for service roles. Today I stand before you to present evidence of a terrible injustice." He spoke clearly and simply, explaining how he had discovered Ta's true intelligence and their journey to gather proof. As he talked, the screen showed documents and images from the archives they had recovered. Orishan spacecraft designs, medical research, artistic achievements. By our own scientific standards, Orishans meet or exceed all requirements for full sentience classification, Daho concluded. Their treatment as property violates not only their rights but the founding principles of our interstellar charter. Murmurs spread through the chamber. Some delegates leaned forward with interest, others frowned in disbelief. A representative from the corporate alliance, which controlled most Orishan labor, stood to speak. "These are interesting claims, but they come from a single researcher and his." He paused, eyeing Ta with disdain, "personal servant. We need more than old files and emotional appeals to overturn decades of established policy." "Then perhaps you need to hear from an Orishan directly," Daho replied. He turned to Ta. "With the council's permission." The president nodded, though her expression remained skeptical. Ta took Daho's place at the podium. The room fell silent. "My name is Ta," she said, her voice steady despite her fear. "Before I was captured and enslaved, I was a neurophysicist at the Central Science Academy of Lanos. I specialized in brain-computer interfaces, ironically, the very technology that was adapted to create these." She touched the neural inhibitor at the base of her skull. "I am not unique. Every Orishan you have classified as property possesses the same intelligence, the same capacity for complex thought and emotion as any human in this chamber." She activated the data core they had brought, and the screen filled with videos. Orishan children learning in schools, scientists working in laboratories, artists creating sculptures and music, all from before the conquest. "This was our civilization," she said quietly, "a civilization that humans destroyed and then denied ever existed." For the next hour, Ta presented scientific evidence of Orishan cognitive abilities, including brain scans that showed neural structures nearly identical to humans. She explained how the initial classification had been deliberately falsified to justify using her people as a labor force. "The original survey team knew exactly what they had found," she said, displaying the classified reports they had discovered. "They chose to hide the truth." When she finished, the chamber erupted in voices. Some delegates demanded immediate action. Others called her testimony a fabrication. The corporate alliance representatives argued loudly about economic impacts and property rights. The debate raged for days. Experts were called to examine the evidence. Other Oricians were brought in for testing. Their neural inhibitors temporarily adjusted to allow them to demonstrate their true abilities. Throughout the proceedings, Ta and Daeho stayed in a small apartment near the council buildings. Each night, they watched the news reports about the case that had shocked human space. "Even if we win," Ta said one evening as they sat by the window, "it will take years to free everyone." "But it will happen," Daeho replied. "It has to." On the fifth day, they returned to the council chamber for the final vote. The president called for order as delegates settled into their seats. After reviewing all evidence and testimony, this council must now determine the classification status of the Orician species, she announced. "Those in favor of reclassification to full sentient status with all accompanying rights, please indicate now." Tai held her breath as the voting began. Across the chamber, lights flickered as delegates registered their choices. Green for approval, red for denial. Slowly, the display above the president's podium counted the votes. The corporate alliance and its allies voted against as expected, but many trade worlds, academic centers, and independent systems voted in favor. The count grew closer. The final vote stands at 162 in favor, 138 opposed. The president announced finally, "By majority decision, the Orician species is hereby reclassified as fully sentient with all rights and protections granted under the Interstellar Charter." The chamber erupted in sound. Cheers, protests, excited conversations. Ta stood in stunned silence. After 6 years of captivity, after believing she might never be free, the moment seemed unreal. Daeho squeezed her hand. "It's done," he whispered. "You're free. They're all free." Implementation began immediately. The council established transition committees to oversee the removal of neural inhibitors and the repatriation of Oricians who wished to return home. Corporations that had relied on Orician labor were ordered to provide compensation and either employ their former servants as paid workers or release them. 2 months later, Ta stood in the garden of a small house on the outskirts of New Seoul on Earth. The neural inhibitor was gone, leaving only a small scar at the base of her skull. In the distance, mountains rose against a clear blue sky. Daeho joined her, carrying 2 cups of tea. The repatriation committee called. "The first transport to your homeworld leaves next week. 300 Oricians will be on board." "Just the beginning," Ta said. "There are thousands more." "Will you be going with them?" he asked, trying to keep his voice neutral. Tai turned to look at him. Over the past months, their relationship had deepened beyond friendship. No longer owner and owned, they had found something neither had expected, a connection based on mutual respect and growing affection. "Not yet," she said softly. "There's still work to do here. The resistance we encountered needs support." And she didn't finish the thought, but she didn't need to. Daeho smiled, relief clear in his eyes. That evening, as the sun set behind the mountains, they sat together on the porch. Ta looked up at the emerging stars, knowing that somewhere among them, her people were beginning to rebuild their world. One day, she would return to help them. But for now, she had found something she never thought possible after her capture, not just freedom, but a home. "What are you thinking?" Daeho asked. Ta smiled. "That endings can also be beginnings." He took her hand, and together they watched the stars appear one by one in the darkening sky.